Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI, Government and the Future. I'm your host, Max Romanek. Today, I am thrilled to have Nidhi Sinha join us. Nidhi is a senior research fellow at the Center for AI and Digital Policy and an REI analyst, where she focuses on making technology equitable and shaping ethical AI policies. Her work includes developing AI frameworks that uphold democratic values and leading international policy discussions for the G7 and the G20. Today, we will be discussing the ethical challenges of AI and national security, such as predictive policing and cyber surveillance. We will explore how to balance innovation with individual rights and the role of AI in shaping global equity. Nidhi will share insights from her extensive experience to illuminate how democratic societies can manage AI's impact responsibly. Welcome, Nidhi.
Hello.
So your work at the intersection of AI policy and ethics is both impactful and critical. But to start us off, could you share how you initially became interested in AI ethics and what motivates you to focus on making technology equitable and responsible?
I grew up in the Bay Area, which is also the Silicon Valley. So I've spent my entire life being surrounded by tech, being told by friends and family that computer science is your only option when you end up going to college. And then at the same time, I've always had this interest in social justice. I'm a woman of color. We have had a lot of social justice movements over the past few years, whether it's BLM or the Me Too movement. And by the time I got to college, I realized that I really wanted to merge these discussions about ethics and social justice with technology. It always felt like these were two really separate parts of my life, and I wanted to learn how to bridge them together. I've been really interested in the different perspectives that can be brought to the table and whose voices are often actually left out of these discussions entirely.
I love that. I'm fairly excited about this conversation with you today. I'm a lawyer by training. I don't practice any longer, but privacy was my area that I actually had some degree of facility with when I was practicing law. And it was also for me about bridging technology and whether or not legal constructs are able to keep pace with the rapidly evolving technological landscape. So I feel like we've got an affinity, at least academically, in terms of where our interests lie. And so I'm really excited to get into the conversation with you today. So let's go ahead and get rolling. There's a really diverse approach to AI governance globally. In your view, what do you think some of the key elements should be that would be potentially included in like a global AI framework? National security is certainly one of the use cases that comes up. But just sort of generally speaking, what do you think the international community should be focused on here?
Right now, I think the biggest focus that the international community needs to have is actually placing strong prohibitions on violating technologies, whether that's predictive policing, social scoring, biometric identification. These types of technologies, in my opinion, I don't think can have enough ethical guardrails just because their very premise is unethical. There also needs to be a prohibition on lethal autonomous weapon systems. This is becoming a larger and larger issue as the years go on, especially with the current situation in Gaza, with all of the military technology that's being used by Israel, all of that destruction that we're talking about that is on this mass, unfathomable scale is happening because AI is enabling it. And it's not isolated to just what's going on with Israel. Other countries are already starting to buy into this military technology too, that they're already creating and also developing their own in-house. And that's why we really need to start putting these prohibitions in place before this becomes an even larger scale issue than it already is.
Sure. I'm going to want to dig into each of those examples sort of individually, because I think each one provides a really interesting discussion point. But just as far as like an international framework goes, where's the current state of the discussion? How close do you think we are to that? What do you think some of the big hurdles are?
I actually think we're very far from it right now. This is a huge gap that needs to be addressed. In my work at the Center for AI and Digital Policy, we release an annual report each year, the Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values Index. And this year we evaluated 80 countries and determined that national security remains a gap internationally. At the same time, the UN did have a resolution to ban laws this past December, which had 152 countries that voted in favor. But there is still this gap between talking about banning things, which can be very appealing to people, and actually banning them, which is suddenly when everyone starts shying away a little bit more.
Right. Just digging in a little bit on those laws, the lethal autonomous weapons systems, for any of our listeners who maybe not be familiar with that acronym. From the get-go, you shared that your stance is that they should not be allowed. But as far as myth versus fact, I think a lot of people hear that and start thinking Terminator and Skynet and all of that sort of stuff. Distinguish for us, where's the reality of the harms that are so concerning with those weapon systems, and where's the stuff that's more on the myth side?
So Skynet's a great example. To clarify, there's no AI that is like sentiently thinking like, I need to kill something as an AI. But what's happened instead is that there are these tools, such as in Israel, where they are saying, how do we determine what are the targets that we need to attack for Hamas? So then instead they have the AI automatically generate an insane series of targets, hundreds of thousands, which has no way for humans to manually review that in the amount of time that they're approving these targets. So what's happening is you have an AI that may or may not be accurate. We don't actually know that part. It also doesn't have any meaningful human oversight, and there's no accountability for whether or not it goes wrong. All of that coupled together leads to the crisis that you have right now.
It's a parade of horribles that you just laid out there. I mean, frequently with AI systems, you get, oh, well, we need a human in the loop to be the check on that. And it's, in this context, what are you really saying? A human in the loop on your hundreds of thousands of entries kill list? I mean, that's a different sort of context than, say, removing bias from college applications.
Exactly. Yeah. It's absolutely absurd to think about. It's absurd that that's like the only example I've said so far. And it's already so heavy because you see it in so many more applications as well, but it's all very scary.
So bringing this back down then to less terrifying subjects, but sort of at the heart of this issue seems like there's a real transparency gap, especially with a lot of government deployments of AI, especially when they're for security purposes. What are some of the consequences you think of this opacity are for things like public trust and accountability?
Well, people just don't really want to use AI anymore, or maybe that's not quite right. They don't feel safe. And there was this recent study done by the Pew Research Center that showed that 52% of Americans feel more concerned about AI in their daily lives than they are excited for it. As you were just saying, we can be excited about like our college applications might be easier. Oh, I don't have to even write my college application essay. Maybe ChatGPT can help me out. But then that coupled with all of the other concerns of, well, now you don't have any privacy when there's smart city technology tracking you, or now you don't have any safety on the internet when you feel like all of your activities are being monitored. So what's happening is people feel less and less safe in their own communities and online. That's leading to this erosion of trust that you're seeing now.
An obvious, sort of solution to that would be, okay, government, don't be opaque. Tell us what these systems do. Tell us how they work. If they were to just sort of turn on a dime and completely change the policy and get really transparent, what do you think we would find? I mean, would we suddenly get the criteria on how these laws are building a kill list, and then there's now public scrutiny for that? Or is it something more complex? Is it algorithmic? And then you'd need to have that extra layer of understanding to even understand what the transparency was trying to tell you.
Right. So I imagine two different things. One is the side of transparency. Well, now everything's out in the open and now we can review this. So that comes into a question where you bring in the independent oversight agencies. So Italy, for example, has a data protection authority that is, in my opinion, one of the strongest in the world. They've already sued OpenAI, I think 2 times by now. And these types of agencies actually hold people accountable or hold companies or groups accountable for their AI. There's no point in having transparency and everyone knowing what's going on if we're not doing anything with that information. Accountability is the natural next step to transparency. At the same time, we also need to just have national data privacy laws in place. We need them to be comprehensive because even if you are being transparent with me, that you are collecting my fingerprints, my biometric ID, just where I'm going on the internet all day, maybe I just don't want that. And what are the laws that need to be in place to say, here's what data you can collect, here's how long you can retain it, here's where it can be used, here's who you can share it with. These things all also need to be in place. So I think transparency is super, super important just so we know what's going on. But we also need to have these actions both beforehand and after the fact of this AI deployment.
I'd like to get a little bit more specific on one of the examples you used around biometrics. They are becoming ubiquitous in terms of security frameworks, in accessing systems being a biometric credential that you need to be able to share. So what are some of the specific risks that these sort of technologies pose to personal freedoms?
When I think of biometric IDs in terms of what needs to be prohibited, I think less about like my personal use because like I have my fingerprint like unlocking my laptop. But I also think about what the national security uses are of biometric ID. And in that case, it's when they are using facial recognition technology to track you on the street. So, for example, in Iran, they have this compulsory hijab law enacted, and they are using facial recognition technology to track women who are not adhering to this law and penalizing them for it.
The idea that you were just getting at with facial recognition cameras that are policing for hijab use in Iran, it's like a speeding camera on steroids, but not for something that's universally equally applied, like you are or are not speeding right now. That seems like we won't get into the ethics of how that country organizes its social policies, but that seems like an example that could kind of go both ways. Have you seen any successful examples of a deployment of technology like that isn't violating people's privacy rights and is actually performing a useful function?
I don't like sounding so negative, but no, I have not. I think this is one of those categories that to me is just so fundamentally wrong that I don't know how many ethical guardrails can be in place to reverse that. There's also this other example I wanted to bring up. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has this side project called WorldCoin. The idea for WorldCoin is that it would be this biometric cryptocurrency tool, and it would use your iris as your identification. And it's currently scanning the eyeballs of people in Kenya for reasons that are not super clear. And there's not a lot of transparency into why they're doing this or how this information is being stored or who it's being shared with. And then this links into national security because this is a private company. This is a private individual who doesn't work in the government, but he's already started making allowances for military usage with OpenAI, with ChatGPT. So I don't feel super hopeful that this other project would somehow feel very far removed from a national security application at some point. But again, because of the lack of transparency and all of the questions that are already surrounding that, is this a project that could have enough guardrails? I don't really think so.
Have you seen any international attempts at trying to put some guardrails around use and deployment of biometric systems? Like anybody that's moving in the right direction, you think?
The state of California has banned facial recognition technology. So there is movement across more local ordinances. I'm a Bay Area local, so my examples are more biased, but you can see that there are already cities that are implementing these types of ordinances. The city of Seattle also has a transparency policy that I think is very strong about how they're using smart city technology to benefit their residents. But then they also have this entire document listing out the transparency requirements, the data collection and usage purposes. And that to me, I think is more of what needs to be happening. I don't know if I'll ever feel fully comfortable with biometric identification at all. And I'm more on the side of states just banning it entirely. But I also think Seattle is a great example of having a transparent usage policy.
I really appreciate the nuanced perspective there. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate being able to unpack that a little bit more. Right at the front end of the show, we were talking a little bit, and one of your examples was on predictive policing. Those systems have been criticized for reinforcing existing biases. But given your expertise, how do you see these systems influencing societal perceptions of justice and fairness?
So I'm actually really fascinated by the thin line people have between crime and morality. A lot of times when people give you ethical questions or ethical discussions to think over, they start with a crime and they add some sort of nuance, like how would you feel if someone was stealing? How would you feel if they're stealing to feed like their child? And like now these are two different questions. The problem with AI is that things tend to turn out seemingly more black and white than they actually are. So what people don't understand all the time is that AI is actually wrong a lot. And it's actually quite interesting with police when they are shown to have evidence that directly contradicts an AI decision, they'll still ignore it in favor of the AI's decision output. So now the conversation about justice has been morphed a little bit into what does the AI actually think, except AI doesn't think. And it is just a tool that is feeding off of historical and systemic inequities already and amplifying them even further and targeting Black and Brown communities while favoring white communities or more affluent communities. And that ends up just fracturing neighborhoods and residencies in general.
From your perspective and experience, is that a process of the fact that the data sets that are used to train AI on predictive policing just have that inherent bias in them and it's essentially impossible to remove it because it's so historic? Or is there another factor in addition going on there?
So it's partially the historic data. And it's funny because sometimes our gut reaction when we say that a data set is inaccurate is to just increase the amount of representation in data sets. But in the conversation about predictive policing, does that mean just increasing data sets of Black and Brown individuals who probably do not consent to that? And what does that feels like just another excuse to increase surveillance on these neighborhoods already. The other parts that come into question are public accountability and trust. When you feel like you have no recourse for a decision that's been made about you, why would you trust the system as it is? There's the Innocence Project in the US that works to overturn wrongful accusations, and they've done some really interesting cases on wrongful accusation with AI and how there needs to be more accountability when these decisions are made.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like a good example of trying to overcome the myth of sentient AI is not necessarily the scary thing. Non-sentient but hyper intelligent AI is almost scarier because it can lead to these outcomes that are harder to predict if you yourself are not the data owner, the data broker.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important for people to be involved in this because even when the AI can like make all of these outputs, it's not necessarily correct. And even if it's correct in this one black and white instance, it doesn't know the cultural nuances the way we as individuals know, or I hope would know about, our culture and our society and where we want to progress from here.
Do you think that's a product of continued need for training and eventually we'll get there? Or do you think it's so complex that these algorithms may never quite put it together?
I think in the context of predictive policing, I don't think there's any amount of training that could get there. Well, even if there was, again, that would tie into the idea of, well, whose data is this being trained upon? I personally am not comfortable with my data going to a policing data set as if I even have a say in that. Yeah. So even if there was enough training, I feel like sometimes we need to focus our questions more on, is this even something that can help? Because you can see predictive policing is aiming to target a goal of making communities safer. But there's also several research studies that have shown that if you instead invest those resources into community programs and support for the actual residents, things get so much better than just relying on policing itself. And communities feel strong for it as well.
And certainly as an implementation of AI, it's certainly one of the examples that's out in the tail, the bell curve. For something that's a little bit less intense, a little bit less charged, but nonetheless still has a historical data set with some bias associated with it, things like affirmative action and employment come to mind. Are there tactics that you've seen that have been effective in trying to cleanse those data sets of bias so that you can train on something clean? Or is that a bit of a misnomer, really? It's not actually something that you can do. You're just trying to sort of band-aid the wound, so to speak.
I would say so. Yeah. I feel like it's a tricky line with AI or any technological innovation, really, because you want to make things better, but the solution isn't just pretending that bad things never happen. I don't think there's a quote unquote clean answer to it. You can make data sets as anonymous as possible. You can enhance as much privacy as possible, but you also just can't walk away from our history entirely. I think it's a really tricky subject. It's a really fascinating one as well, because what does that actually look like in implementation? And it's one that I'm still grappling with, if I'm being honest.
I think if you're going to lead an introspective and extrospective life, how could you not? It's definitely that's participation in the zeitgeist these days. I want to switch gears here just a little bit again and focus in on the idea of AI for cyber surveillance. I know we've been talking about it in the periphery through a lot of these examples, but getting right down into it in terms of the opportunity for privacy violations through that cyber surveillance, how does the balancing actually happen between the things like national security and individual privacy rights in the context of AI? Like, where does the rubber meet the road with that?
I feel like it's kind of interesting how governments or any group really will be talking about surveillance as so tightly tied to national security and almost saying that we should be kind of fudging the more important parts about privacy and right to freedom of expression and right to dignity and all of that for the sake of national security. But to me, I don't think this trade-off is very worth it, right? So we can say that this is making things safer for our society, but at the same time, surveillance is used to discriminate against specific groups and crush political dissidents and generally just increase the amount of fear and violence and distrust that we already see in our day to day. So I think that we need to have much, much stronger guardrails in how we're using AI in the context of national security, not just what shouldn't be used, which we've been talking about, but also what do we expect for the tools that, as the EU would say, are more of a medium risk instead of a severe risk with their AI Act.
Certainly Ben Franklin is on your side. Very famous quotes from him. And certainly our governmental system in the United States historically has been one of the few that sort of articulates that privacy right and tries to enforce it through our Bill of Rights. But through my time in law school, I'm sure you've seen it too, that dynamic is always a new thing is invented. It is used for these purposes, and then we have to litigate it out to determine whether or not that was a permissible use months and years later. And so the legal systems obviously drag behind the technology systems, and that was a problem back to our inception and is only getting worse with these new iterations happening faster and faster on a regular basis. If the law isn't going to be able to keep pace, what other sort of measures do you think could be done to try to provide some protection from these AI tools?
While regulation is still catching up, we do have human rights standards already that advocate against surveillance. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which promotes your freedom of opinion and expression. You have the Universal Guidelines for AI, which prohibit against secret profile and unitary scoring. And there's also the OECD AI principles. There's a lot of these different existing frameworks. And then on community levels, I think people are already developing these own personal tactics to feel like their privacy is more protected from surveillance. So using more encrypted web browsers or using VPNs or guarding your privacy in public as well and watching what you post on the internet. So I feel like people are starting to carve out their own ways to have this sense of agency. But obviously, there still needs to be a lot more done on the regulatory side instead of playing catch up.
It does strike me that this is a difficult area for the international community to have a real powerful voice because every one of those sort of frameworks that you discussed ends in the same question: enforcement. How do you enforce? Like the International Declaration of Human Rights has lots to say about these things, but you can't take that to a US court and say, you violated this clause here. I demand some sort of compensation or remuneration for it. And then also, what legal remedy is there? My privacy was violated. Monetary rights, monetary compensation may or may not be helpful in that context if it was just a privacy thing that didn't have monetary value, but maybe was embarrassing, something like that. And so, it definitely highlights the concern with the issues. And, domestically, we have had a very difficult time having Congress get proactive around prohibiting technology on privacy grounds. It has almost always had to follow the court there. And so if we were in that sort of circumstance where you had the ear of a committee and they actually were going to do something in this case, what sort of recommendations would you make? What sort of policy cornerstones would you recommend that they really take seriously?
I think I've got a few. So one is I feel like sometimes people get very hand wavy about what do we do about regulation? They've got no idea where to even start. There is so many ethical frameworks that are already out there that the US especially has already signed on to: the G7 Hiroshima AI principles, the OECD AI principles, UNESCO recommendations on AI ethics. These have all been widely endorsed across all of the countries in the world. And it's time to actually start implementing them. They lay out very well what rights need to be protected, and it's time to start referring to that and actually start putting that in action. I would also say that there needs to be more public participation involved in the policymaking process. We talk a lot about human in the loop in the AI life cycle, but what about before the AI even gets to start being developed? What about when we're making the policies that even enable this tech? So including the communities who are going to be impacted is a weirdly simple but not very used suggestion. If you're going to make something that impacts the disability rights community or the queer community or Indigenous people or rural communities, these are all people who will be impacted by AI, and their voices should be heard. They will give you the ideas that you need to create strong regulation that protects them, because they already know. It's our lived experience. We already have started pointing out things we want changed in our own everyday lives. It's time for governments to actually start listening to that. There also, coupled with that, needs to be more awareness about how AI is being used in the first place, because not every community even knows that AI is being used against them or that their data is being collected. And that opens up a whole other avenue to let people have an informed opinion as well about what they want done.
That's some really salient advice. I love the idea, simple though it may sound, of actually talking to the communities you plan on providing regulations around, whether they be for their benefit or their detriment, understanding the purpose of the regulations and soliciting their voice before you're enacting it. Dead simple, but super wise in terms of, trying to make sure that you've brought the right audience to the table, that you're not excluding people from the discussion right out of the gate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll people feel safer too. And it'll make people feel like they trust things too, which we had talked about earlier. And that is, if you want to talk about promoting trust with the government, this is like the biggest way to do it for sure.
So, related to that, looking forward, how do you envision the integration of AI in government evolving within democratic societies? And I'm particularly interested in the non sentient, hyper intelligent algorithms and whether or not that is actually incompatible with democratic institutions.
I try not to have too much of a pessimistic view on things, but the news does get me as much as I think it gets anyone these days. We're going to be taking a lot of steps in the wrong direction before we start taking the right ones. There's a lot of people who are already calling out military technology in Israel or militarized cops presence in the US itself. But these things are still not stopping yet, and there's still a lot of funding going into them. And I would like to believe that what's the phrase, the wheels of justice always turn in the right direction or something, that at some point we will have to come to our senses and enact these bans and put in these prohibitions. I just think it's going to take longer than I would like for it. I would like for it to have happened while we were on this call and I get off and, everything's already done. That's probably not happening, or this week itself, but I think it's going to take some time. I don't think that AI and national security currently is very compatible with the ideals we all have about democracy. I think given how outspoken people are already being about this usage, the fact that it is continuously being developed and invested and funded really concerns me. But I think I have to believe as much as anyone else that if, we all keep voicing our concerns and keep advocating for better things, it just has to get better.
I mean, that certainly is the hope, that the last gasp of the democratic institution is the ability to preserve itself in this context. I certainly hope it doesn't come to that, but I have to confess that I tilt more on your side of the fence where it really makes me quite anxious. And I'm very scared that we're not going to catch it until it's too late. And so I think it's all the more important for bringing a perspective like yours forward and giving it a platform to hopefully reach a few more ears and influence a few more minds. As far as other elements within the preserving of democratic values, can you brainstorm some safeguards that leaders in democratic countries should be looking towards to try to preserve the structure of the government that they are a part of?
One of the recommendations I make the most in my work as a policy researcher is independent oversight agencies. I think that they're a really strong and concrete way to actually hold countries and groups accountable for the technology that's being developed and deployed. I also think starting to develop policies around explainability and transparency standards as well. What documentation do we expect? Are black box models okay or not? These are the types of questions that need to start being addressed in policy. And if you're using a black box model, for example, can you use it in this context or that context? So the EU AI Act, for example, did a pretty good job of breaking down different risk classification systems. So those are the types of things that we need to start implementing. Having auditing available for tools to see how effective they are, how they're impacting communities, how ethical they are, what is the amount of risk with them. These are the types of ways to really bubble wrap our technology to make sure that it is actually, achieving this goal of helping people and not hurting them.
I really appreciate that perspective. That was my last question for the interview, but before we adjourn, open floor, open platform. Is there anything else based on the theme of this conversation that you think our listeners would be interested in knowing?
I think one closing thought that I would have is I see a lot of pushback, even with AI policy people, about talking about military technology. A lot of people feel very attached to their home countries, which is their right and prerogative to do, but find it really interesting for people to work in AI policy and talk about ethics so much and then get very defensive when we start talking about military technology and how it's being used. And if it's your country using it, all of a sudden you feel like there should be a way to work around this instead. So I feel like I would encourage people to look into that discomfort a little bit further and think about rules for me and not for thee, as they say, does not really work with AI ethics. And I think at the end of the day, protecting your rights is what matters the most. And that I think is something that we need to really ground ourselves in with our work.
Thank you. Very powerful words to close on. Nidhi, thank you so much for today. This was a really excellent discussion. And to the rest of our listeners, we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.